Hey everyone, welcome back to here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today. Today's part 5 of my cumulative case for Christian Theism. Today we'll be looking at consciousness and the nature of limits. If you haven't checked out the first 4 videos, I highly encourage you to check that out. The link is down below, but let's get into today's series. So, to introduction, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So, in chapter 1, or part 1, I argued that truth is the most important thing that one should think about. In chapter 2, I argued that there's a necessary foundation that is the explanation for everything contingent. From this point, I began to probe the nature of the foundation. Chapter 3 argued that design points to a rational foundation rather than an irrational foundation. Chapter 4 then argued that God would explain reason and moral knowledge, whereas an irrational foundation would not explain these phenomena. In this video, I will argue that the existence of consciousness points to God, and I will argue that arbitrary limits point to an unlimited foundation. Okay, so with consciousness, perhaps there are no two more famous words in history than I think, therefore I am, from the French philosopher René Descartes. What makes you who are reading this book you, or who are listening to this video you? Each person who is listening to this is a unique person. You have first-person experiences of the world, feelings, emotions, intentionality, power, and the ability to make decisions. Your first-person experience is what we call consciousness. This gift of consciousness is pretty amazing if you think about it. You just reflect on the nature of just being able to think. So cool. So let's consider the hypothesis then of materialism. This is an idea that nothing exists beyond the material world and the interactions between material phenomena. In a world composed solely of material things, it may be possible to explain the laws of physics, atoms, biological evolution of organisms, and just about everything else in existence except the most fundamental thing we know to exist, our own conscious experience. David Chalmers introduced this as the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem is the challenge of explaining how we have conscious experience if we live in a purely physical world that once existed without conscious experience. Computers, mountains, and toilets all exist, but they don't have first-person experiences. In other words, if the world is full of just like material stuff like tables and speakers and computers, there's no room for the existence of mental stuff if the world is exhaustively consumed by material stuff. So my argument from consciousness goes like this. Consciousness is more likely on theism than atheism, so consciousness is evidence for theism. So why think that like consciousness exists and that consciousness goes beyond like a mere physicalism? Consciousness first is the most fundamental thing we know to exist. Before we assume anything else to exist, we must assume the reality of our own conscious experience. Furthermore, there's good reason to think that our consciousness isn't merely the product of firing neurons. There's something more to my love for my parents than how my brain operates from a physical standpoint. We possess genuine mental properties. By genuine mental properties, I mean the idea that our mental states cannot be merely reduced to physical events. In other words, your conscious experience is not merely an emergent property of the brain, rather there is something fundamental about the nature of consciousness. This is a point that both theists and atheists can agree on. There's atheists who are dualists or idealists, or panpsychists, views where they agree that the mind is in some sense probably fundamental, or at least not just like merely emergent from the physical. Theists and atheists can agree. So why is consciousness more likely on theism than atheism? If God is conscious, as most theists would affirm, then the probability of consciousness existing given theism is just 100%. If God exists, it must follow that consciousness exists. If this holds, then consciousness must exist given theism because God exists. The reason that the existence of consciousness is like 100% expected if God exists is because God is a conscious agent. God is a perfect mind. So if God exists, then there has to be consciousness because God exists as a conscious mind. Now, the more interesting question is probably why would the existence of other conscious agents such as you or me be more expected on theism than atheism? First, theism has the resources to explain consciousness. If the foundation is a mind, as theism suggests, it would be a simple explanation for the existence of other minds, a supreme mind. Persons with mental properties could be created from a mind, God. So there's a really good explanation for why can other minds exist given theism? Well, because there is a perfect mind, and mind is fundamental in the world. Second, if God exists, he would create good things rather than bad things. Being that it is good for conscious humans such as ourselves to exist, it would be good for God to create us, and he'd have a reason to create us over maybe something bad or something indifferent. Materialism and thereby some forms of atheism, though, will run into a construction problem. The construction problem asks, how can any combination of material substances, how any combination could create mental properties? No combination of red paintings could create a green painting, nor any collection of prime numbers could create a prime minister. Likewise, how could any number of neurons firing together ever create a conscious experience? How does the personal arise from the impersonal? What I'm trying to get at here is you can think about the fundamental nature of like impersonal reality, of like pens or tables or or whatever. These things aren't conscious. How can you add a bunch of unconscious things together to create consciousness? It seems like there's just some sort of contradiction here, in the same way that like adding a number of like prime numbers can never just create a prime minister. It's just different things. Unconscious things are just different than conscious things. To elaborate, physical objects such as a pencil have a certain weight, location, and color. They can be divided into halves. However, consciousness doesn't have any weight. It can't be located, and it's not divisible. Your thought of a cute puppy doesn't weigh anything. Consciousness is a completely different kind of thing than what exists in the physical world. Simply stated, the question becomes, how can one construct an immaterial, weightless, unlocatable mind from physical matter? Many atheists have realized the problem of materialism and its inability to explain the existence of consciousness, so many have turned to new views of consciousness, such as panpsychism. Panpsychism claims that consciousness is a fundamental part of the world, and that consciousness is a part of all of reality. Everything, to some degree, contains consciousness, according to panpsychism. While this view is promising, and a theist can be a panpsychist, theism still explains the existence of consciousness better. I agree that panpsychism may be true, but this view lowers the prior probability of atheism. In this case, atheism must believe that reality is both fundamentally material and mental, whereas the theist needs to only assert the mental to explain the same data. So, why prefer like a theism over maybe like an atheistic view of panpsychism? I'm going to say that because theism can explain all the data with just mind, whereas panpsychism is still going to have to appeal to mind and matter. So theism in that sense is going to be still simpler. Okay, so again, I was writing this originally as a book, but I turned it into a lecture series. So when I was writing it at that exact moment, there were 944 words in this section as I was typing it way back when. By this point, there are now even more words. Why would there be 966 words rather than 967 or 965? Because that is how many words I would have typed to this point. We live in a world full of limited things. The amount of coffee in your cup can be measured, and your home has a particular size. Now, what if I told you it was just necessary that there were 2,964 words total in this chapter or this slideshow, because I changed it? That it was just a brute fact without explanation. It was just, that's the way it was. You'd think it'd be absurd. When things are limited, there's an explanation for why that object is the way it is. We can explain the number of words on this paper by pointing to my action in writing this. Yet the foundation that explains the universe lacks any further explanation, going back to chapter 2. Nothing caused the foundation to be the way it is outside of itself. So how does this provide any evidence for theism? Let's look at limits in my argument. Premise 1, the foundation does not depend on any further explanation for its existence. So 2, anything with an arbitrary limit has a further explanation. 3, therefore, the foundation is something without arbitrary limits. Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water, and then I will defend the argument. So first, the foundation does not depend on anything for its existence. The first premise should be rather uncontroversial. It's important to remember that contingent facts depend on a further explanation for their existence. This is in contrast to the foundation, which does not have any further explanation beyond itself. We can think of the foundation as a first cause. There's nothing that comes before it. The foundation would have no further explanation for its being. If something caused the foundation to exist, it wouldn't be the foundation. Rather, the thing that caused that would be, in fact, the foundation. So when we're looking at the foundation, we're looking at the end of explanation. What's here without any explanation? So the foundation doesn't depend on anything because there's nothing before it. Okay, now, number 2. Anything with arbitrary limits has a further explanation. Why think that arbitrary limits have a further explanation? In our experience, limited things have explanations. There's now 1,233 words in this section, which is explained by my prior typing. However, limits don't just apply to the number of objects, but also their shape and weight. If an atheist was to argue that the foundation was some sort of fundamental particle, it could be asked, why does the particle have the shape it is? Why does it weigh 1.07 ounces instead of 1.06 or 1.08? Why does it have a volume of 2.05 square feet rather than 2.501? Limited things intuitively beg for a further explanation because of our natural intuition that limited things require an explanation for why they are, in fact, limited. So, finally, number 3. Therefore, the foundation is something without arbitrary limits. However, if the foundation is a mind, God, there would be no arbitrary limits that have a further explanations. Traditional conceptions of God seem as a perfect being, an unlimited mind. So instead of posing an arbitrary limited number of fundamental things, theism posits an unlimited God. God's perfection has no limits. While physical foundation would have things such as particles with a particular weight and size, theism claims that God would not be constrained by limits in weight and size. Theism provides a limitless foundation, whereas atheism leads to positing an arbitrary limited foundation. So let's look at some objections to my argument from consciousness and my argument from the mind. Or argument from the limits. Doesn't consciousness just emerge from the brain? So it's fair to say that most people would agree that changes in brain states can cause changes in mental states. However, this doesn't mean that the brain causes and is solely responsible for the existence of the mental states in the first place. There's a relevant difference between correlation and causation. My friend Jono said this. In Sydney, Australia, there's data showing a strong correlation between the number of shark attacks and ice cream sales at different points throughout the year. Here's a hypothesis. During the summer, the increased heat means that people are more likely to buy ice cream and go to the beach. As the people go to the beach, the frequency of shark attacks goes up. So here's another hypothesis. Because of such correlation, we should assume that ice cream is identical to a shark attack. Anyone who would make such an inference deserves nothing but incredulous stare. Similarly, merely appealing to correlations between physical brain states and mental states is not enough to explain consciousness. Just because there's correlations does not mean there's causation. We can find correlations between all kinds of things, but that doesn't mean that one causes the other. More work needs to be done. Also, there's many different theories in the philosophy of mind, such as panpsychism, idealism, and dualism, which all agree that changes in the brain cause changes in mental states. Panpsychism, the view that all things have a mind-like aspect to them, agrees that changes in physical states result in changes in mental states. However, this doesn't mean that physicalism would provide a satisfactory explanation for the emergence of consciousness. Idealists who argue that everything that exists is a mind or the product of a mind would say that the brain reflects the mind. Dualists who argue that we are composed of two substances, mind and matter, would agree that matter interacts with the mind. All these theories agree that there is a correlation between mental states and physical states. However, these theories show that mind-brain correlations do not demonstrate that the brain causes the mind in the first place. It's the burden of the physicalist to show the data that physicalism explains that other theories in the mind do not explain. And to this point, no satisfactory account has been given. So I'm basically trying to attack the idea that correlations between the brain and the mind prove physicalism, because they don't. Correlation doesn't mean causation. And also there's many different theories that would say, yeah, we totally agree. So you can't just assume physicalism because of these correlations. You're going to have to give more work and more arguments. Okay, here's another objection, the reverse construction problem. So perhaps one might say, well, if there's a really big problem of how matter can create a mind, how on earth can a mind create physical matter? So it seems like in the face of this problem, the theist can still explain all the data by positing a foundational mind, whereas the atheist still cannot explain everything by appealing to physical matter. I believe the theist can answer this problem by becoming an idealist. I'm not totally sold on idealism, but I do think it's very plausible, especially for reasons like this, because I think it can get around this issue pretty well. One idea in the philosophy of mind, idealism, says that everything that exists is a mind or the product of a mind. One rough analogy is to say that we are living in a dream world. In our dreams, we can conceive of physical objects that we can interact with, but our dreams do not have a mind-independent existence. I think it's plausible that the physical objects we encounter while awake are a part of God's dream, where He has created, and that we live in. So we could say we live in something like a dream world, which is a solution to the problem to say the physical world can actually exist as a product of the mind. So it also seems possible that I could be wrong about the existence of the physical world. I could be living in the matrix, and that computer in front of me could just be in an illusion. Perhaps my experience of the external world is an illusion given to me by aliens. However, I know I cannot be wrong about my existence. I think, therefore I am, from René Descartes. It seems as if the most fundamental thing in existence that I should know of is my own mental experience. If I must choose about what most likely exists fundamentally, I should choose the most fundamental thing I know to exist, my mind. I could be wrong about the physical world, but I couldn't be wrong about my own existence and my own mental experience. If this is the case, we have strong reason to choose that mental is fundamental rather than physical. I'm saying we should choose the mental over the physical because we know with certainty the mental exists, whereas we don't know with certainty the physical exists. Okay, now another objection asks, how much can we really know about the foundation? So this is going back towards arbitrary limits now. So someone say like, well, how do you know that the foundation just isn't arbitrarily limited? Like there's all kinds of possible explanations and maybe it's just brute and that's the way it is. So this is an important point in which to bring up the intellectual price tag of atheism. The arguments for limits shows that the atheist will almost certainly need to add limits to his or her hypothesis of the foundation, which is something that the theist doesn't have to do. This provides the theist with an advantage when thinking about simplicity. So in that respect, the theistic hypothesis of the existence of God would result in less fundamental entities at the foundation. Philosopher Trent Dougherty elaborates on this explanatory price tag of atheism by writing, bare theism's fact is the existence of a person with two properties, knowledge and power, held in the simplest possible way, zero limitation. Any atheistic view of the foundation would almost certainly be more complex by positing arbitrary limits, whereas the theist doesn't have to. So I'm going to say, well, if you want to say that we just don't know and maybe it's just limited and it is what it is, I'm going to say, well, you're going to add a cost to your theory by adding complexity. Okay, one more objection here is the Trinity. So it's important to remember when we're looking at the Trinity, it's the doctrine of like the three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If I want to say like the Father, if the God is like unlimited, there's no arbitrary limits. Well, what about there being three persons? Like why are there 3 versus 4 or 5 or a million or 2 or whatever? So arbitrary limits, this argument argues that there cannot be unexplained limits at the foundation of reality. So if there is an explanation for why God exists as a Trinity rather than 2, 4, or 100 divine persons, then this objection would do no damage to the argument from arbitrary limits. Now, the correct explanation for why God exists as a Trinity is not known with certainty, but there are plausible explanations going from Swinburne to Macintosh to Kuhn's, all kinds of other ideas. So there are plausible explanations for why God can exist as a Trinity, and if there is an explanation for God's Trinity nature, then this objection to the arguments from limits can be defeated. Someone said it's possible that there could be explanations within the foundation for why there is this arbitrary limit. Obviously, if there is no explanation, then that's a cost. And the arbitrary limits argument that I presented would be a very big problem for the Christian theist. But I'm going to say if we can explain why God is triune, then we can still run the argument. So in this section, I've concluded that we've had good reason that the simplest account of the foundation is a limitless mind. This can be seen through our awareness of the fundamental, irreducible nature of our own mental experience. We could also see that the foundation is without arbitrary limits, such as the number of particles, shape, or mass, because these add unneeded complexity to the foundation. The simplest hypothesis, given our knowledge about consciousness and arbitrary limits, is a limitless mind, God. So this is part 5 of my cumulative case for Christianity. I encourage you to stick around. The playlist is linked down below. Be sure to check it all out. Really appreciate you and your time. Have a good one, and God bless. We'll catch you next time.